Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Bramman, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society for the next couple months until Rachel Brown takes over. This has recently been confirmed. I'm very pleased to welcome you tonight to our 2025 Distinguished Lecture in Islam. The series is funded by an endowment created by a number of people, some of whom are anonymous and some of whom are quite well known, almost heroic figures in our community. All of you, those of you who are here and those of you who are not here, thank you. Special thanks goes to Naz Rayani, the Victoria resident, most likely to be called a living saint, and the champion of the Distinguished Lecture in Islam Programming and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society for many years. Naz's commitment to building a better world through community building, both on campus and off, is, as many of you know, legendary. And he knows how important it is to include the many peoples whose lives intersect on this little part of Turtle Island. And so I know he shares our wish to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and the Sage peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today we're in for a treat for the mind and the eyes, as our speaker, Dr. Heba Mostafa, will take us into and beyond the early period of Islamic history in which the distinctive architectural styles of the tradition were established. Our lecture will be about 40 minutes, and that'll leave us with almost half an hour afterwards to reflect on what we learned from her. Dr. Mostafa is Associate Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture, the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto. Before moving to Toronto, she held positions at the American University in Cairo, the Arab Academy for Science and Technology, and the Department of Art History at the University of Kansas. In addition to holding a PhD from Cambridge, she has an MA in Islamic Art and Architecture from the American University in Cairo. Heba is interested in the history of sacred space, embodiment, and ritual practice, especially as these get defined in the medieval period. She's also interested in the early centuries of the Islamic imperial period, and I'm especially eager to learn more from her about the ways that the built environment that we might associate with Islamic societies reflect these communities' engagements with Christianity and Islam. But enough about what interests me. I want to invite you to join me in welcoming Heba on the stage.
Thank you very much. I wish to begin by thanking my host, the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, with a special thanks to you also to Paul Ramadan, Rachel Brown, as well as Scott Dolph and Rico Cruzal for their organizational support. It is always an honor to speak in my country of Canada, and as this is my first visit to Victoria, a particularly special experience. Before I begin, mindful of the varying levels of expertise and knowledge in our audience today, this is for you, Scott. I wish to offer a brief sketch of 3 moments in early Islamic history that lay the foundation for the ideas about architecture that I will explore with you this afternoon. Did you do that?
I did.
Okay, then I'll do better next time. Islam rose out of the central western part of the Arabian Peninsula that you see here on the slide, today modern-day Saudi Arabia, at the end of the 6th century of the Common Era, gaining traction as one of the major monotheistic faith groups within just a few decades of its inception. The Prophet Muhammad, born in Mecca, which is also the spiritual center of Islam and home to the Kaaba, with it as its central shrine, preached a monotheistic message that engaged closely with Judaism and Christianity, and thus affinities with both faiths permeate the Quran, as well as many Muslim beliefs and conceptions of the sacred. This will be key as we explore Jerusalem, the latter part of this lecture, so please keep this at the forefront of your mind for now. 3 events in the life of the Prophet Muhammad are also crucial for my exploration of early Islamic architecture. The first is known as the nightly journey and heavenly ascent, which is believed by Muslims to have taken place during the first half of the Prophet Muhammad's life. Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad to have been transported by the Archangel Gabriel from Mecca to Jerusalem, journeying on to the heavenly realm to encounter several biblical prophets, culminating in a divine audience within the celestial court. This event marked a high point in Muhammad's journey and trajectory as a prophet and is considered one of the most sacred events in Islam. This is one of many reasons why Muslims consider Jerusalem to be sacred, and in part explains why the Haram al-Sharif that you see here on the slide, which means in Arabic simply noble enclosure, but is also known by many names such as the Temple Mount or the Bayt al-Maqdis. I'll go through a more extensive list in a moment. And the Dome of the Rock, they were established within only 60 years of the Prophet's death in 632, with sacralization of the enclosure occurring immediately following the Muslim takeover of the city in 636. So as few as 4 to 5 years after Muhammad's death in 632. The second moment is a turning point, whereby Islam went from a relatively small group of adherents to a religious and political movement to be contended with. That is, the Prophet's immigration from Mecca to Medina, where he would soon attract a following, author the famous Constitution of Medina, establish a small military presence, and crucially for Islamic art historians, found the first mosque, where the earliest elements of Islamic architecture began to take shape. What you're looking at here is a reconstruction of that mosque based on textual accounts, because the original has not survived. This will be important later, so again, please take note. The final event is Muhammad's death in 632, which occurred suddenly and left the community reeling in shock. The history of this moment is complex and very difficult to capture in just a few words, but it suffices to say that the leadership that emerged after his death entailed election by council of one of his close companions, beginning a period known as the era of the rightly guided caliphs, whereby 4 of the Prophet's companions ruled in succession. Imagine if Christ's disciples had ruled after his death. This was a time of interconfessional strife in which 3 out of these 4 rightly guided caliphs were assassinated in mosques. This period ended following a civil war which saw the violent killing of the Prophet's own grandson and the rise of a new dynasty known as the Umayyads, named for the tribe of its founder. So not by election. Yet the Islamic world was by no means united under his leadership. A few decades later, it would erupt again into the Second Islamic Civil War. Furthermore, these rulers, known as caliphs or khalifa, struggled with their identities. They were not prophets, nor could they claim that right, but they also hesitated to adopt the titles of kings and emperors, as Muslims viewed them as tending towards tyranny. And they had, of course, just vanquished 2 of the most powerful empires, led by a king and an emperor. The track record wasn't looking so good. Muslim rulers came instead to be known as caliphs, which literally means successors. Successors to whom? Depending on the context, sometimes God's successor, or sometimes the prophet's successor. But this title evolved over time and had many variations, with some variations occurring at the same time in different contexts, which itself is a symptom of an identity in flux, or even perhaps in some readings, an identity in crisis. These 3 crucial events and their ripple effects, the Prophet's journey to Jerusalem, is found in Muslim understanding as a physical transportation to Jerusalem, but in other mystical accounts in Islam, a metaphysical transportation. But it suffices to say that Muslims believe Muhammad had some kind of embodied physical presence in Jerusalem. his foundation of the first mosque in Islam, and the events that unfolded politically after his death in 632, in many ways deeply informed the history of the first century of Islamic architecture. So remember our three founding events. Let's see if you can connect the dots with me. And now that we've laid this foundation, let's move on to the particulars. The central problem in the study of early Islamic architecture lies in two inescapable realities. Very few traces of the earliest mosques and early palaces have survived, and the evidence we do have in the form of written accounts date from a much later period, often several hundreds of years, and rarely offer extensive descriptions of monuments in a way that we require them to be to understand the building in any great depth. With this reality, we are confronted with a gap in the architectural record of approximately 8 decades from the construction of the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina in 622, and before monuments such as the Dome of the Rock that you see here on your right was constructed in 692, and other monuments such as the Great Mosque of Damascus, which was constructed about a decade later. We are thus in need of a history for this lost interval, as it is a crucial time when we know the history of Islamic architecture was evolving, because we saw what emerged on the other end, the Great Mosque of Damascus. And a way to write architectural histories for these important decades became my task. The architectural histories of the intervening years are thus conventionally viewed as largely irretrievable. And in fact, this is a caveat to every study of early Islamic architecture. Because of their fragmented nature, the nature of the archaeological evidence, which is contested. So just to give you context, much of what we want to know lies buried beneath cities and will probably never be excavated. Some of it is lost in its entirety. Asserting the immutability of this inescapable gap is in fact a preamble to every work on early Islamic architecture and archaeology. You always have to, say, oh, we're going to do this, but it's impossible, and these are our limitations and so on, which is true and remains true. And that's where our problem lies. The first part of my book today will explore my own escape attempt from this bind through my monograph, Architecture of Anxiety, Body Politics, and the Formation of Islamic Architecture, which is circulating, and you'll be able to view a copy, which offers an alternative history for this crucial lost interval, these 60, 80 years, depending on your periodization. In the second half of my talk, I'll briefly explore the Haram al-Sharif and Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem as they relate to the understanding of the formation of early Islamic architecture as an architecture of anxiety. And I promise I will explain my title. As I have previously mentioned, the formative period of Islam saw its rise as a religious and political entity from a small contingency surrounding the Prophet Muhammad in Medina to a nation state, during which vast swathes of territory were secured under the 4 rightly guided caliphs and their successors. Within decades, Islam's first ruling dynasty, the unelected Umayyads, flourished despite internal division. So when we're thinking of the Islamic world, this is the world we're imagining. This is larger in its largest extent than the Roman Empire. And something that I think is really worth emphasizing. Now, obviously, Spain is not quite under their control yet. It would come under their control at the end, basically end of my book. So if you imagine this map without Spain, but Spain is quite important to establishing sort of the Umayyad hegemony. But something to think in mind is that from the time of the death of the Prophet till this farthest extent is also only 60 or 70 years. So this is empire building, as I would call it, on steroids. This is faster than any empire emerges, and the architecture emerges along with it in this accelerated rate, which makes its reading even more complicated because we have this gap in which so much happens. Usually in 80 years, we don't see so much change and rapid development, and the Islamic world is a bit of an anomaly. And this period, this time period that I mentioned, also happens to coincide with the emergence of some of the most emblematic elements and monuments in Islamic architectural history. So much of what you see today in a conventional Islamic monument was established in these first 8 years. One of the tools that I deploy in the book is the use of these collapsed timelines. Now, the different colors show different periods of rule. And this is a timeline that collapses specific moments of violence against the caliphal body. And I'll talk about that more in a moment, with changes to the architecture. So I hope you'll get a chance maybe in the book, or I'm also happy to share a PDF of this visual to show you how this is part of my approach to try to understand changes in the architecture as it relates to kind of the unique nature of early Islamic architectural history, but we'll come back to this. Okay. These architectural changes, of course, include the first mosque in Medina, which we do know from textual accounts and which has been reconstructed, but keep in mind this is purely reconstructed from accounts and has no archaeological footings. The introduction of such novel elements as the mimbar, and a mimbar is a type of pulpit, and you can see here an example from the 9th century made of wood. So they really did develop quite quickly. Their earlier iterations were far simpler. And finally, the third element, or the second element that evolved in the mosque architecture is the enclosure screen. And if you look behind the mimbar, you can see a wooden screen. These would have been screens that served a very important purpose in the mosque that we'll get to in a moment, mainly for the protection of the caliph. And of course, the final element would have been the minaret and also the dome above the Qibla area. The Qibla is the part of the mosque that faces Mecca and is intended for the leading of the prayer. All of these elements we have very little evidence for. So I'm showing you our earliest surviving mimbar or pulpit. This period also includes the earliest caliphal urban palaces, which date from the first half of the 7th century, and which I devote almost a third of the book to an analysis of them based on textual accounts. They have such cryptic and elusive references to these fabulous green domes, which I try to untangle and interpret through the lens of a late antique heavenly dome, through the filter of an Arabian sensibility, which also haven't survived. And of course, the jewel in the crown, the dome of the rock in Jerusalem. So what we're really talking about here is the seminal elements, the critical moments in the development of Islamic architecture. Despite these architectural developments, this was also a period fraught by multiple succession crises, 2 civil wars, 3 political assassinations, and many other violent killings, and the emergence of a sectarian schism that persists to the present, which really could have very easily precluded Islam's survival as a polity. In fact, close readings of this history reveal multiple moments of profound political vulnerability, particularly surrounding the First and Second Islamic civil wars. This was really a time when the state should not have survived. The question for me then became, knowing that the Islamic empire not only survived, but thrived for centuries, did the architecture play a role? If it did, then reading parallel histories of the formation of the Islamic State with all its complexity and the development of the architecture should reveal a relationship at critical historical moments of architectural change. And it absolutely does. Specifically, collapsing these timelines reveals how changes to the architecture map closely onto caliph's physical bodies and their mutually constituted and evolving identities. And I mean by this, how they sat, where they sat, what surrounded them, where they moved, and so on. And their life worlds. And I mean by life worlds in the conventional academic sense, but really everything that entailed their rule as caliph, from their public speech to the perception, to their clothing, and so on. How and where they sat among their followers, and how their ways of sitting were perceived, how they were kept safe in the mosque, how they projected authority, but especially how they navigated their shifting personas among various authorities and projected power to their rivals through architecture. For a caliph preaching in an empty mosque is as soundless as a tree falling in a forest. These histories are not top down. Rather, they implicate the community deeply and recognize the mutual constitution of such authority. Throughout the book, I frame this paradigm of anxiety as one derived from the moment of the Prophet's death in 632, which marked a momentous shift because it transformed what Muslims accepted as an orthodox chain of command. From the recognized, charismatic, and highly credible religious and political identity of Muhammad to successor with a more fragile connection to that same authority, the caliphs and governors who succeeded him. It's precisely within this double bind of an absent chain of authoritative transmission with the Prophet's death. So the Prophet's authority is gone, and you have that void. But then you also have the anxiety spurred by the ambiguity around caliphal identity. This is what I argue is what forced the caliphal body and persona into a multivalent and nebulous state. The architecture helped. Haunted by identities they both longed for and feared, prophethood was sealed. And this is crucial in Islam. There can be no, in Sunni Islam, there can be no successor to Muhammad. He's the seal of the prophets. But kingship was cursed due to its negative implications. Caliphs' identities emerged as a negative. They weren't prophets, they weren't kings. And with no precedent for the caliphal rule, their identities and titles became chimeric and variably responsive to their changing context. So oscillating along this spectrum of established norms of rulership, they can't escape that they're not prophets and they can't claim to be prophets, and they're struggling with their identity as not kings. Their early spaces at the mosque and palace and the seats they assumed became nebulous. In other words, the architecture surrounding the caliphal body reflected, mitigated, and engaged, otherwise existed symbiotically with an anxiety around their identity. And that's where my title, Architecture of Anxiety, comes from. So the book retrieves, we're looking here at a very famous coin known as the Standing Caliph. So when we're talking about identity projection, this is what I mean. This is the patron of the Dome of the Rock, and he's standing here holding a sword with Quranic script encircling him. And this is the Muslim proclamation of the faith. Now, this is a real transformation from the early coinage that would have kept forms of Byzantine and Sasanian coins. So this is a moment when this pictorial identity is really manifesting very strongly. So the book retrieves the spatial implications of this anxiety by framing the formation of Islamic architecture specifically around 5 audience-related micro-histories. So my way around the problems and gaps in the evidence is to go small. At the intersection at these moments of collapsed architectural timelines. So specifically, I move from the seat, from the mimbar and the types of thrones, to the space around the caliph and the mosque, to the palace, and I end in the Dome of the Rock, and you'll understand why in a moment. So it's expanding around the caliph's body. Each of these moments can be considered microhistory, and they focus upon specific moments when the caliph sat in audience and encountered the public, where the deeper architectural histories are doing their work to mitigate this conflicted identity. But why choose audience as the way to understand early Islamic architecture? My editor asked me that question, and this is my answer. I'm very grateful to her for doing so. The choice of audience as the structuring principle of this book derives from the nature of the formation of Islamic architecture in relation to public audience. It has a unique story. We're looking here at manuscripts dating from a much later century. It's just there to evoke to you 2 types of audience. One that could have occurred in a mosque setting on the left and one in a palace on the right. So they're different. They serve very different experiences. Public audiences in early Islam typically took place between the mosque and palace and melded the political and religious in various ways. And a very simple way to think about it is that they had a split identity. They were religious and they were spiritual. They were religious and spiritual, but they were also political. And so in a way, it's a simple way of understanding this split identity. As an embodied experience, the audience event reveals so much about architectural history. And tracing it is effective because audiences, unlike many other events, were worthy of inclusion in the historical record because they often captured speeches or something very bad happened during one of these public audiences, so authors would record them. And in the course of recording them, they leak information about the architecture. Moreover, changes in Islamic architecture align very well with these audiences. from the introduction of the mimbar, maksura, and the development of the prayer area to the palace and its audience hall. So these audiences are happening in the spaces that we know so little about. So these reconstructions allowed me to maneuver around the problem of missing physical evidence through a very simple assumption that I broke, which was, how come you can write about a caliph, but I can't write about a throne? The sources talk about both. And this is just a very simple biography of objects approach, which in my discipline hadn't been deployed to solve these kinds of problems. Deployed in other contexts, but not in this one. So I constructed these biographies of mimbars, of pulpits, of thrones, of enclosures by just looking for them and wrote deeper histories around them to make sense of how they emerged in context. These accounts are particularly important because of what they reveal about activities in the mosque and palace. For example, there's a lot of evidence that the prophet's mimbar became a symbol of the caliph's authority, and the prophet's mimbar came to be treated like a relic, even fought over. So we have accounts of caliphs saying, we want the mimbar, and people in Medina saying no, and if they move the mimbar, there's a solar eclipse, and they're like, see, we told you. And so it becomes very contentious. And from these anecdotes and the sniping, interconfessional sniping, we get a lot of valuable information. We also know that because of this sacral history, the mimbar took on an exclusive role as a platform for both religious and political speeches in the mosque, following the precedent of the Prophet Muhammad. So the mimbar becomes hugely important. But what of other seats? Did caliphs sit on thrones? What the sources reflect is that to overcome this stigma around the throne, which is attached to kingship, early rulers sat on a type of bedstead known as a sarir, and they could justify it because it was very multifunctional. So we have accounts of caliphs sitting on it, and then someone would die, so they'd move the corpse out of the palace on his throne. And it's this very interesting relationship where it's exalted and takes on these exalted titles, but then also has these mundane quotidian uses. Very, very interesting. And then they would also sit in more humble seats known as a kursi, which was probably a foldable seat because it would move between palace and mosque. And they would hold different types of audiences seated on different types of chairs. So when you really think about a sort of split persona, they're using different titles, they're sitting on different seats. We know also sometimes they would dress in different ways depending on the different audience. These accounts are vital in explaining why early Muslim rulers adopted enclosure screens within mosques especially. For the evidence strongly suggests that rather than being adapted from churches as conventionally viewed, which was a very rational supposition, the enclosure screen is actually indigenous to pre-Islamic Arabian architecture, and they were deployed specifically to protect the caliph as they emerged after the first political assassination in Islam, that of the second rightly guided Caliph Omar. So these are not coincidences. And when we start looking closely at these microhistories, it becomes very difficult for us to sort of make these surface assessments of how the architecture is unfolding. So by unveiling these accounts from around the caliph's body and projecting it outwards, I was able to reconstruct the developments of their adjoining urban palaces as well, specifically the palaces in Kufa and Damascus. So what we're looking here again is the mimbar, but this fabulous fresco is from an Umayyad palace. It's from a later Umayyad palace, but do you remember the bedstead I was talking about? This is of Caliph Al-Walid II in the Jordanian palace in Qusayr Amra, and here he is on one of these sarirs, which would have been used in the palace. And the fresco aligns perfectly with the textual descriptions of these types of thrones. The palaces were similarly fraught because of Islam's attachment to open public preaching in the model of the Prophet Muhammad and to avoid any vestiges of kingship. But palaces were needed, of course, for administrative and diplomatic purposes. You're looking here at a reconstruction on the left and an archaeological drawing of the remains of the palace in Kufa in Iraq on the right. This is a particularly contested site, and I devote a chapter to trying to untangle it by doing a close read of the patron's history. All of these tensions inform my reading as the architecture evolved in dialogue with complex factors, both internal and external. Finally, this reading exposes the formation of Islamic architecture as parametric. That is, responding to a set of unwritten rules, comprised of a mixture of function, beliefs, memories around architecture, fears, anxieties, akin to how software might run, informed by a submerged logic, which may be inclusive of moments of borrowing and adaptation. Of course it is, but not governed by it. And this is a key point, because conventionally, the history of early Islamic architecture has sort of been understood as, okay, so they borrowed this from the mosque, they borrowed this from the synagogue, they borrowed this from there, which really, as an undergrad, I bought into this. It made so much sense. But then when you read the sources, you realize there's this whole other history that they're talking about that has not really been paid attention to. So, of course, these things are in dialogue. It's not that it's black or white, but certainly these histories are ones that I strive to bring to the forefront. I ask quite simply what role the architecture could have played in the midst of moments of historical violence, considering this anxiety around caliphs' identities, who were obliged to hold public audiences in the mosque and palace. It's not like they could retreat and just stop holding public audiences. Eventually they do. So within 200 years, they're not really playing this game. But for the first 100 years, they are obliged to continue this practice. While the book at the outset questions how architecture was shaped by various forms of existential anxiety, decades of civil strife, 2 civil wars, the assassination of multiple caliphs, almost 80%, and the attempted assassination of many others, there were several failed assassinations, including an attempt on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. This reading ultimately reveals how architecture was crucial to the creation of a sense of existential safety, representing in turn how Muslims striving for enhanced experiences of embodied sanctity and longings for divine encounters and experiences of the otherworldly in the midst of this turmoil. So the answer to the question that I posed, we know it survived and thrived. Did architecture play a role? I've uncovered mounting evidence that the architecture played an absolutely critical role. And not to give the game away, but it was absolutely rooted in pre-Islamic Arabian practices of nonviolence, specifically around sacred enclosures and managing water rights, and securing safety in times and places where walls were not an available option. You couldn't build a fort even if you wanted to. So for example, there were tents that were inviolable. There were rock formations that were inviolable. We see this in indigenous cultures too. And so it's a really, it was very eye-opening, and I was shocked that it took me so long to reach this realization. So this brings me to the final portion of my talk, where I'll briefly explore the Dome of the Rock and the Heba Mostafa in Jerusalem as the final chapter of early Islamic existential anxiety, and a site where caliphs sought to navigate their own identities in relation to the ultimate authority of God's own divine throne. So here's where the little history lesson at the beginning is going to come. The reason I framed this as an existential anxiety, so we were talking about this anxiety around identity, now it's leveling up, because this is a different kind of anxiety that permeated not only the Islamic world, but the entire late antique world, and that is the fear of the end days. At the time of the construction of the Dome of the Rock and the Heba Mostafa, Muslims believed the end of days was imminent, and that it would occur precisely at this occasion. I show how caliphs who struggled with their identity found Jerusalem to afford them a priceless opportunity to secure a new dimension to their authority by serving as guardians of a sacred shrine that would one day host the pinnacle of all sacred events, and as inheritors also of the kingship of the prophet kings David and Solomon. While there are many interpretations of the Heba Mostafa and Dome of the Rock that consider how it was closely in dialogue with Christianity, the local architecture of Jerusalem, the political context of the Second Islamic Civil War, I will focus in the last few minutes on one aspect of my interpretation that I consider the most dominant. And in fact, I argue for a multi-level understanding of the Dome of the Rock. There's no such thing as a singular understanding. All of it can and probably was operative at the same time, which is what makes it one of the greatest monuments in Islamic architecture. And my analysis is based chiefly on studies of how the rituals within the Dome of the Rock were conducted. So by understanding how they treated the rock within the Dome of the Rock. Let me skip ahead so that you can see what I mean. It's a rock. It's actually the summit of a mountain, but we'll get to that. How it was anointed and richly circumambulated, and the prayers and rituals and all the practices around it allow me to further this interpretation around the rock being, or at least part of the sanctity being enshrined in this idea as a future locale of the divine throne. Not only the future location, but in fact also Muslims at this time believed it was the location of the past celestial thrones, specifically in Muslim accounts of creation. So a simple way, as my students say, so the throne was there and then it was gone and it's coming back. And that's really the best way to understand it from a Muslim perspective. They talk about it very explicitly this way. Now, this is not to say that the heavenly ascent of the Prophet Muhammad is secondary. I'll get to that in a moment. But rather the significance of this sacred mountain, which today you cannot see. It's underneath a platform and underneath Jerusalem, but at the time was a mountain. And its rootedness in multiple sacral associations. Now, it's a site that's captured the imagination of monotheists and non-monotheists for centuries and is known by many names, including the Temple Mount, Beit al-Maqdis, which means the house of the holy, Beit ha-Miqdash, maybe you're hearing similarities between the Arabic and the Hebrew, Masjid al-Aqsa, or the farthest mosque, which is how it's referred to in the Quran. And part of it is referred to as the Templum Domini, or the Lord's Temple, under the Crusaders. And these are all somewhat synonymous. They're referring to a similar repertoire of sanctities, and above all are reflective of its layered history as a sacred precinct within the sacred geography of the Holy Land. Understood by early Muslims as the first Qibla, or direction of prayer, the Haram al-Sharif, which in the Quran is referred to as the farthest mosque, is also described in the Quran as the destination of the Prophet Muhammad's nightly journey, and thus inherently blessed by God. So something that I think is important to understand is that the reason that in the Muslim understanding, the reason it's the site of the heavenly journey is because it's already sacred. It's not that the nightly journey makes it sacred, it's already sacred. And that's why it becomes this locus. Central to Islamic conceptualizations were pilgrimage guides and other treatises that explicated and enriched devotees' multifaceted experiences of sacred sites of Jerusalem and allowed them to position them within a broader history of sacred geography and several key sacred figures. So think of all the greatest hits of the Bible. In Islam, they become very closely concentrated. So Mary has a place. Many angels have a place on the Haram al-Sharif. Of course, David. And in fact, that little pavilion there took up at least 5 years of my life. In one of my second publications, that's the Dome of the Chain that commemorates David. And so we're really talking about a very rich layered sacred history here. Commemorated beneath the Golden Dome lies this eponymous rock, which, as I mentioned, is not an ordinary rock, but the summit of Mount Moriah. And the mountain's mass, of course, is concealed and has been concealed since antiquity, surrounded by urban fabric. For early Muslims, the rock was very much understood as a sacred summit, and its sanctities predated the construction even of the Solomonic Temple because of its association with creation, and was embedded, of course, within a network of sacred summits. Think of Mount Sinai, for instance. So shifting our understanding to the primordial and the inherently sacred from the Muslim perspective will be important to help understand all the complex sacralities that lead to the nightly journey and heavenly ascent becoming attached to this site. And although by the end of the 12th century, the rock itself had become associated with the heavenly ascent, so that's where things get a little confusing. In fact, Islamic art historians over the past few decades were able to show that, in fact, early Muslims, i.e. the patrons of the Dome of the Rock, understood that the ascent of the Prophet actually occurred somewhere near the rock, which left open this question of, well, what is the Dome of the Rock commemorating? It's not commemorating the location of the ascent of the Prophet Muhammad. And what subsequent interpretations have been able to reach is that there may be multiple reasons why the rock is sacred, but one of the interpretations that I find to be the most convincing is that it serves as the footstool of the divine throne. And that's how it's described in many of these pilgrimage routes. Now, there are other interpretations, of course, that foreground the political context. But the reading of that associate the Dome of the Rock with the divine footstool and future location of God's throne can also be supported by the iconography of the Dome of the Rock itself. As an 8-sided structure, the 8-column shrine can be read as an architectural analog for the Quranic description of God's throne, which is described as being borne by 8 angelic hosts. Now, the fly in the ointment of this interpretation is that this also follows the form of Christian martyria. So could have been a pleasant coincidence, but there's other compelling evidence, mainly textual, for the association with God's throne. Additionally, the Quranic inscriptions within the shrine, here I am at the last slide, which emphasize the absolute unity of God, also reference Christ, and specifically reference Christ in the context of his identity as a human man, i.e. not Son of God. And of course, this reading of the inscriptions really pulled scholars towards positioning the Dome of the Rock as a so-called anti-Trinitarian message, that the Dome of the Rock is intended to broadcast this message to Christianity. But these readings have been problematized or challenged somewhat by your own Marcus Miller. Christ is also believed to play a pivotal role at the end of days alongside the Prophet Muhammad, and references to the Prophet Muhammad's intercession on the Day of Judgment are also part of the inscriptions. So the textual evidence, other iconography from the mosaics as well, and you can read all about it in my book. In other words, there is mounting evidence that the Rock and the Haram al-Sharif were believed to be commemorative of past events and anticipatory of future ones, looking back to the time of creation while also looking to a future. Now think back to these embattled caliphs. This is the best place to be. This is where you want to be as a ruler. And in fact, many of them received their oaths of allegiance in Jerusalem, and we believe some of them in proximity to the Dome of the Rock, even before it was built. So hence the circulating ideas around its sanctity. I began my talk by presenting 2 highly significant Islamic monuments in juxtaposition: the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina and the Dome of the Rock. The former known only through textual accounts, and the latter the most heavily studied monuments in the history of Islamic architecture. These monuments are part of a continuum. As for Muslims, they would have been seen as 2 poles of God's authority on earth. On the one hand, the Prophet sat within his mosque, a humble structure, preaching from upon a 2-step minbar, a message that Muslims believe to be of divine origin, teaching the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the verbatim word of God. For the latter, the Dome of the Rock, it was considered to be a shrine commemorating a sacred mountain, dating back to the time of creation itself. And in fact, in some accounts, not even of the world, may have been, in this pilgrimage guide I mentioned, descended actually whole from heaven in order to be a suitable locale or locus for God's divine throne at the end of days. So not even of this world, not just a sacred space, but not even of this world. And in this way, these monuments represent pinnacles, anchors, a place where Islam's prophet preached, and a sacred mountain enmeshed in several histories of divine communication, which allow us to understand how early caliphs navigated everything in between, right? So the Mosque of the Prophet to the end of days and God's throne. These are your anchors of authority, the poor caliphs. They were spiritual proxies at best, but their architecture allowed them to maneuver the complex identities architecturally, to uphold something of the prophet in their monuments, and to serve as guardians of the sacred shrine, the Dome of the Rock. By narrativizing how early Islamic architecture was shaped not only by histories of physical objects, archaeology, and spaces, but by our sophisticated conceptualizations of Muslim memories, of understanding of objects, spaces, of whole Muslim life world, affords us a perspective to excavate the texts that is guided by the material, but not restricted, not, I would say, even sometimes strangled by the tyranny of the material, creating in this case a conceptual rather than an archaeological layer, upon which our future studies may one day find a point of departure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Heba. So now we have about half an hour for some conversation. Can I take advantage of my role as chair?
Yeah, sure. Can we have a sip of tea?
Sure.
I'll trade you.
And just ask you to elaborate a little bit on the kind of anxiety about the embodied experience of the caliphs with their uncertainty about their authority and how that might shape the actual design of a mosque.
Sure.
It was easier in the first part of the lecture, I think, to see that than in the second part. I wonder if you could just make that connection and then we can turn things over to them.
Absolutely. So would you like me to elaborate more on the changes in the mosque specifically
Yeah.
that relate to that?
Mhm.
Yeah, so just very concretely, I actually have the slide here. This is the Mosque of the Prophet of Medina. Very quickly, you see the columns at the top. That would have been the covered space where the Prophet Muhammad would have led the faithful. Now, after his death, the successors also would have preached from that space. The leading of Muslim prayer, of course, involves the imam or the leader of the prayer standing in the front and rows behind him praying. Now, that's just for the moment of prayer. Outside of those moments, the mosque functions as an audience hall, as a school, as a court. So it's this multifunctional use that draws in so many actors into the mosque and where caliphs would have had to be present, right? So it wasn't enough for them to just lead the prayer and leave or send a proxy to lead the prayer and leave. That would happen eventually. But for this particular period, they were very present and they had to be present because standing in the mosque and preaching is how you showed that you were the caliph. Now, that was dangerous. And we know from textual accounts it was dangerous. It was dangerous for caliphs. It was very dangerous for governors that were being sent to some provinces to put down rebellions. And they would sit on the minbar and threaten the community. And in fact, one of the first accounts I found of these enclosure screens that were constructed, I found because there was an account of a governor arriving in a very embattled city in Iraq, sitting on the minbar, basically saying, you know, I see heads are going to roll if you don't obey me, applying quite strict regulations to bring the province to calm, and then being pelted with pebbles, like at the end of the speech, just attacked. And in that moment, he immediately retreated to the Maksura, and his bodyguards were able to save him. And then he retaliated against everyone who had, quote unquote, attacked him. Now, these are the kinds of histories, like, it's amazing for me that the community felt emboldened to be like, we don't like this governor. Like, let's just like egg him, basically. And in these moments, we start to see other kinds of negotiation spatially. So this same governor is the one that had his palace now connected to the mosque. And he was one of the first to insist on direct access because from his mind, you know, there were other precedents where the governor would just walk through the mosque and go head off to his palace. But keep in mind, so many of his predecessors had been assassinated. So this was actually the most efficient way to balance these two roles. You need to be there, you need to be preaching. You can't be surrounded by armed bodyguards because the criticism, it was, the optics were terrible. But you also didn't want to die. And in fact, your caliph didn't want you to die either. So the connection of the mosque and palace doesn't occur in every province in the Islamic world. That's really the proof that what we're seeing is really specific to certain moments and tensions in the Islamic world. So we see it in Iraq, we don't see it in Egypt. We don't see it in Egypt because Egyptians, you know, they weren't rising up. They didn't have as many tensions and problems around specifically violence towards the Prophet's family that occurred in Iraq. And if you know anything about Islamic history, you understand why Iraq is a special case. So we see in Iraq the architecture playing this role. So we have the palace and the mosque directly connected. So the governor can hold audience in the palace and very, very safely move into the mosque. And he's got two levels of safety. He's got the enclosure that can be locked until calm can be brought to the mosque, and then he can be escorted into his palace, or he can just escape. And seeing these patterns emerge in parallel with so many of these events really makes the narrative. It took me a long time even to become convinced, because I had my own, like, this can't be done. I'm not gonna see any pattern in this, all this evidence I'm finding. But seeing it in some places where the civil wars were boiling over, and in other places where things were calm, allowed me to unfold some of this history.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is fascinating. Can't wait to get to your book. Just a comment and a question. I think that the way you're approaching this could be a wonderful repost. People like Vansborough and all of those folks who talk about there not being enough of a record and are dating things much later. I don't know if you want to just comment on that. I'm wondering if you brought Damascus into the picture, because the anxieties in Damascus were very different, right? Or much more direct. The issue of post-prophetic authority, and even scriptural monotheism, because you're a large Christian community. So how does, in a sense, Jerusalem in that whole, how did they see the relationship? And do you see the same anxieties architecturally playing out in Damascus because it's at the same time?
Yeah. So for this talk, I had to skip over the whole chapter that engages with Jerusalem. And so to start with the first half of your question, I'm familiar with the theories that sort of try to date many of these developments later. There are even some ideas that the patron of the Dome of the Rock wasn't even a Muslim, and that at this time that Islam was a lot more fluid in its own identity, and the Dome of the Rock gets pulled into some of these debates. I don't subscribe to them. They're not well attested enough. And in fact, I think they're actually refuted by what we see in the transformation of the architecture. But for your second point, Damascus, of course, was the capital under the Umayyads. And the transformations that we see in the mosque, and also specifically in the palace, become really crucial to the establishment of a caliphal identity. So in chapter 4, I reconstruct from textual accounts everything that I was able to find on the first caliphal palace in Damascus, which I argue was quite central to establishing a certain kind of conciliatory / authoritative identity for Caliph Muawiyah, who was the founder of the Umayyad dynasty. So Damascus plays an extremely important role. I deliberately chose not to include the Great Mosque of Damascus as my final chapter, because my whole argument is that these are the missing years, and I wanted to flesh them out and not almost have the argument be hijacked by what we see later happening in the Great Mosque of Damascus. So all the developments that we see in the Great Mosque of Damascus, all of the architectural changes that we see in the Great Mosque of Damascus, that are ascribed to Caliph al-Walid I. And I mean by this, the introduction of minarets, the dome over the Qibla area, all of these changes, they predated Walid. And we see them in other provinces. Actually, we see them not even in the Caliphal Center. We see them in Iraq before. So in many ways, this early period is one that complicates some of the readings in the later period, but also allows us to have different kinds of conversations also about the formation of the Islamic State. Thank you.
Thank you. Right.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So I'm wondering if in fact you've got a parallel process around anxiety and architecture going on in the Byzantine Empire. Some of the parallels are obvious in terms of linking the palace to the place of worship, but also when you look at the history of Byzantium, assassination of emperors, dynasties. So is there some sense that that what you're presenting us with is also a paradigm for being able to look at state formation and architecture as a kind of interactive process?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And thank you for bringing up sort of there are other parallels. There's nothing quite like what happened in the Islamic world because it's so big, so fast, so rich. You know, I don't think there's a really a good parallel because of the speed. And I think time is a huge ingredient here. But I think I would say that it's really the architecture that brings these different dynasties into dialogue. You know, as our second skin, it will always step in, or we will always deploy it as a way to guard and to mediate. And one of my students actually drew my attention to the fact that assassinations over time in Islam became more poison-centric because the architecture was doing too good of a job. And when she said that, I was like, she's like, have you ever considered, Professor, the development of poisoning? I was like, wow. She's like, think about the history of assassination in Islam. I think there's something there. And where what that is pointing us to is that the architecture is almost, or at least the way that I've understood it, is that it's kind of like our loyal friend. It's going to erupt where we need it, even if it's just symbolic. So for me, these tents in pre-Islamic Arabia that were inviolable, they were even used, and this really blew my mind, they were used as prisons. How can you have a cloth prison? It makes no sense. But the psychological impact of breaking free of that cloth structure once you've been placed in it must have been so tremendous that it was as firm as a stone wall. And really that is where I think we need to think differently about how the mind and mindset and emotions and ideas around building and our conceptions that only a firm structure is architecture. Architecture can interact with our very complex human condition in really fascinating ways. And I think that's what you're picking up on when you're seeing resonances with Byzantium. Thank you. It's a beautiful question.
Just thinking about how quickly the empire expanded and how much land they were consuming and controlling. And I'm just thinking about Brian's work in his PhD. Wouldn't there be an impact of that kind of growing affluence on the architectural design? And would that be in tension with the effort to keep the caliphs or whoever's running the show safe?
Yes, absolutely.
Because there's like the second one, the Dome of the Rock, like the tremendously powerful showy quality to it.
Yeah, so it was even more showy. These blue tiles date from the Ottoman period. It was actually covered in gold, gold mosaic specifically. Yes, so they did many things to manage the growth of the empire. And one of the maybe the best examples that I'll mention is that the second rightly guided caliph basically issued some kind of decree that all mosques should follow a specific template. And that was because he wanted an architectural identity for Islam. And he knew how easily mosques, there would be all these innovations and inventions. And he also understood, as many Muslims also understood, that the ritual was also bound to the nature of the space. So one very concrete example that they applied is that in the earlier mosques, because they were frugal and sometimes prioritizing other investments, the ground wasn't paved. So when Muslims would pray, they'd get dust on them. And then as they rose from their prostration, they would flick off the dust. So the caliph ordered that all the mosques have small pebbles. Those are the pebbles that were used to pelt the governor, so that it wouldn't become part of Muslim law. They were afraid that if this is what Muslims do, then suddenly Muslims would be praying, and then 10 years later, everyone's doing this because it becomes part of the ritual. So it's incredible how the ritual and the building were really enmeshed in a way that Muslims became very protective of. They also were very determined. They're very determined to maintain an egalitarianism. So actually the Maksura was controversial, but because the deaths of the caliphs were so tragic, it was accepted. Because when the Muslims knew that when their caliphs died violently, it caused so much. And so in a way it was tolerated because it wasn't used so much to exalt the caliph. Over time, of course it was. And in fact, if you go to Cordoba, you see that little enclosure is now a whole room. and the Great Mosque of Cordoba.
Yeah.
And I close my book with that example.
Hmm.
So we do see this sort of, and now I don't know where I began to answer this question, but
I was really curious about the tension between fanciness and safety, right? Because if part of your argument is that the mosque has a kind of a second skin to protect the
Yeah.
new leaders who weren't
Yeah.
Muhammad.
Yeah.
You know, there's a tension between fanciness and safety.
absolutely. So at every turn, they had to defend the fanciness, every turn. But they were really skilled at presenting convincing narratives. So the governor, the one that was pelted with pebbles, part of his identity is that he had to walk with bodyguards, and he would say, "I need to be defended." But he wore what the sources described as simple shoes. And he did that deliberately to kind of offset the effect of having armed bodyguards. So they were very mindful of how their image was projected. And although, so the same governor would not have had these sort of lavish decoration in the palace, but reportedly had inscriptions that were like his manifesto on good governance. So we have a great deal of evidence that they were trying to sort of balance. Eventually they stopped and they went full on glamour mode. And we have some beautiful palaces, especially in the private palaces. But we know in public, they tried to maintain an image of austerity because the Prophet Muhammad was so insistent on this. And he conceptualized it in a fascinating way where he was able to exalt poverty without stigmatizing wealth, which is incredible. And I talk about this also in my book around luxury and luxury objects and so on. So this was a complicated relationship with wealth, with power. And they tried in many ways to maneuver around it because their legitimacy was so rooted in public perceptions of them. They needed to secure oaths of allegiance. And it's not just one oath of allegiance. These were multiple oaths of allegiance. And even though the Umayyads knew they could force these oaths, they weren't always successful. And for part of the Umayyad period, there were two caliphs ruling during the Second Islamic Civil War. So the image crisis was a very real thing with true political implications.
Jessica.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mostafa. This is fascinating and really interested to hear about your method and that discovery of kind of there's going to be touch points between these chronologies. I would like though to ask you about the contemporary moment and this idea. I'm really taken with this idea of architecture as giving a sense of existential kind of security in a time of social crisis. And I wonder if you look around Canada or walk around Toronto, do you see buildings doing that or not doing that?
Yeah.
Or maybe
Yeah.
structures doing that?
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, we see in protest movements how temporary structures and temporary encampments create a sense of community and solidarity.
Yeah.
I would say that's huge. In our own university campus, we had Indigenous elders creating spaces for our students when they felt especially threatened and very vulnerable. Even in the Dome of the Rock itself, when I visited during my field work, it was a space where women brought their children, and the children would play, but very quiet. And it was incredible how it was a space for women and children to just sit somewhere quietly, not even to pray. They were just sitting in the space that is the very definition of sanctuary. And I'm sure you understand the context of Jerusalem in this sense for a Muslim mother and child. So it's a really good question, and it's something that you know, it's something that I think architecture will do reflexively. And also, of course, the terrible things that architecture does in forms of incarceration, for example. So the power of our built environment to shape our reality is really profound. And it's why I never underestimate the ability of writing architectural histories to help us understand ourselves. Our own, I learned more about what Muslims experienced by tracking how they were freaking out in a building, you know, or finding comfort or seeking solace. And the big argument around the Dome of the Rock is, why did they build the Dome of the Rock, you know? And I think the reason I find the argument that I support so persuasive is that it works because humans need it. And the interpretations that argue that it's political, I don't think is convincing, because this is a shrine that's survived and is upheld, not only because of piety, but because it's needed. And it has always been needed, not just by Muslims. And this is an important point to emphasize, not just by Muslims, by Jews and by Christians too. And so I think I'll leave it there.
Could you explain more about what you mean by needed?
It's a place to experience God. And it's really as simple as that, whether you understand it through the history of Judaism and the temple, or you understand it through Islam's interpretation of its sanctity, or you understand it through the Crusader lens. They're all doing the same thing. And it's really for a faithful person, this is the be all and end all of human experience. It's this experience of God, which is why, for example, Sufis will use the Dome of the Rock as a metaphor in their writings, because it becomes this tangible symbol of kind of a place where the veil can be ruptured. So the last section in my book is architecture of an other world. It is about an other world. And in many ways, I think what I learned by reading the pilgrimage accounts was this incredible longing. You know, when you read the accounts of visiting Jerusalem, it's not just, go and visit these things and get all these brownie points and go to heaven. It's very loving and very longing. And it's sort of this experience that when you read its description, it's extremely moving and poignant. And I'm sure it's the same in other religious tradition. I haven't examined the pilgrimage guides of Christians, but my colleagues who talk about it and write about it, there's a very similar human longing. It happens to, of course, focus on Jerusalem. And the cruel irony, of course, is that that's not how we all get to experience Jerusalem today. That's, I think, the Jerusalem tragedy.
And the state and religious authorities around the dome, the last 2 times I was there, make it as difficult as possible, actually.
It's very hard. It's very hard to have a spiritual experience at the Dome of the Rock. It's very hard. It's hard because there are people that are also scared. It's hard because there are faithful that are excluded. For all of those reasons, it's a very difficult experience for many, and for some Muslims and for some Christians, they can't visit Jerusalem at all. So for Coptic Egyptians, it's very difficult for them to visit Jerusalem for political reasons. So these are all things that, the cruel irony is that Jerusalem should be a place of comfort, of serenity, of love, of peace, of this experience of the ultimate human experience from the perspective of a faithful person, and it's not.
Heba?
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating discussion and presentation. I think it's really important that you are putting the Dome of the Rock in an architectural continuum of developments and not just pointing to its exceptionality. And then going back to the time of its creation, is the anxiety really, what do you think? And I don't know if there is a definite answer. Do you think the anxiety was really about negotiating, creating something that would be very visible, but that would open a negotiation of associations, memories to its audience, its users? And is there a danger to that? Perhaps, or was the anxiety about creating something extremely confident that would show to the world, that would sort of see the religious experience of people up to that and show what a very, very big part of Islam really is? Does that make?
Yeah, no, I think I've understood your question. When you actually pause for a moment and imagine Muslims encountering Jerusalem in 637, when they conquered the city, and their relationship with at the time, what was the site of the temple, the ruins of the Temple Mount, and the ruins of other later Byzantine structures as well. The immediacy of this building program is actually something quite remarkable. So they immediately start resacralization efforts. The construction of the Dome of the Rock is this gold shimmering monument on one of the highest points in the city. I think Mount of Olives is higher, but it's all covered in gold. The dome was gold, the exterior mosaics were gold. This was an extremely self-assured and confident move, but also not alien at all to pre-Islamic Arabians, because lavishly decorated standalone structures were something that they were familiar with. The Kaaba would have been covered in brocade and precious cloth. And that was, in a way, so one of my colleagues has actually interpreted the Dome of the Rock as being more like a Kaaba than like a martyrium. Like, even though it's shaped like a martyrium, it's wearing the clothes of a Kaaba. And the Kaaba in Mecca was not the only Kaaba. There were other Kaabas in pre-Islamic Arabia and other structures that would have been cloth structures, even churches, that would have been ornate and quite distinctive visually. So from a late antique perspective, it's a monumental structure that is meant to catch the eye, and that is true. From a pre-Islamic Arabian perspective, it's a Kaaba, like all the other Kaabas they've encountered, and it's doing the job of a Kaaba, which is honoring a place. And if you're familiar with the Kaaba, it would have been an empty building. Now, it would have housed objects through history, but there's nothing inside the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a place. It's not necessarily commemorating anything. And you can think, or it's obviously commemorating an important place on earth, of course. But I mean, it's not like there's a footprint or there's a relic or something that's being honored. What's being honored is a place on earth, in the way that the Dome of the Rock is a place on earth that's being honored. So it happens to be a mountain and it's a rock. So we get confused and we think what's being commemorated is the rock. What's being commemorated is a place on earth. So in a way, it is, they're, I guess on some level, shrines to the natural world too, but it's the natural world in connection with another realm. So certainly a very sort of self-confident move on the part of early Muslims, but also not as alien or unfamiliar or radical as we would imagine when we put it into a different context. I hope I answered your question somewhat.
We can tease it out more at dinner. There's two questions left in the room, but we only have about 2.5 minutes left. So there's one in the shadows. I saw your hand, but I don't quite.
I just wanted to get back to your previous points about the purpose for an individual going to the dome or mosque was for the discovery of God or a communion with God. Do you also think that in that journey that it is also a discovery of oneself? So there's a dualism.
Certainly it would have been all of the rituals and experiences that a Muslim would have expected to have in the 7th century or 8th century visiting the Dome of the Rock would have been intended to exalt the highest Muslim self, to experience that elevated state of spiritual consciousness. And that was the intention. And if you even think and scrutinize the rituals, you can imagine how they could have also enhanced this somewhat altered state. So entering the shrine, it would have been heavily incensed. The ritual circumambulation in a crowd with a recitation of Quranic verses and prayers. You do that for a length of time, and you will be physically altered and more open to experience other kinds of experiences. Now, with a deep-rooted belief that, you know, the pilgrimage guide you're reading or you're having read to you talks about, well, when I visited, I heard angel wings. And when I visited, this experience happened. That creates an anticipation of a kind of experience, which is very hard for a modern sensibility to understand, but not difficult at all for any practitioner of a religious practice to imagine what that could have felt like. And it's these kinds of mental scape reconstructions that I try to bring into the conversation when we talk about ritual practice and architecture.
All right, so we have 1 minute left. So Frances, you can either ask her question or hold it for tomorrow at coffee.
I'm not sure if I'll come tomorrow, so that's why I'll ask.
I'll be quick.
Okay.
I'll be, actually, I had two questions. One is the role of emptiness. The experience of a mosque, at least is of a really empty space surrounded by.
I can answer that one quick. Yeah.
And the second is the relationship between the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock.
Absolutely. I'll be very quick. So you're absolutely right. The intention of the mosque is to be a space for the community to gather. There shouldn't be anything in there because that's where the community will gather and fill it, pack it, right? So Muslims are expected to pray shoulder to shoulder with no gaps. So this is a container for the community. So it's empty because it's meant to be filled periodically throughout the day. So that's the one answer, right? And it's non-hierarchical. So it's filled to the brim. There's no holy of holies, there's no other than the maqsood. So that's the first answer. The second question, could you quickly recap?
The relationship between the Al-Aqsa
And yes,
and the Dome of the Rock.
okay, very good. Very easy to understand. You remember that enclosure? Now, the Aqsa is a covered prayer hall. It doesn't have a courtyard like all the other mosques because the whole enclosure is the courtyard. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine inside the courtyard of an enormous mosque. That's actually a way to understand it. It's hard to imagine it that way, but that's how it's understood. It's in Masjid al-Aqsa, which means the farthest mosque. The entire enclosure is a mosque. Part of it is covered and it has a shrine in the courtyard. Like many other mosques, the Great Mosque of Damascus has a shrine within it. It just happens that this is an enormous shrine. That's it.
Thank you very much. All right, thanks very much, Heba. Just a little reminder, next week, same time, but in a different place, in the sub in the upper lounge, Jacob is going to be giving us his artist in residence talk / performance / discussion. It's going to be great. We always lightly cater that too, so it's a kind of a festive final big event of our programming year. So please join us for that. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good week.